Welcome to the world of science fiction, where extraordinary tales and boundless imagination come to life. Enjoy the journey. Mark Holloway stared at the notice illuminating his hollow screen. His coffee growing cold beside his keyboard, the Galactic Alliance's mandate glowed in harsh blue letters. Notice of alien placement 48 hours. Damn it, he ran his fingers through his disheveled dark hair, glancing around his apartment. The place was a mess of old datapads and half-finished articles he'd abandoned months ago. Outside his window, the sounds of protests echoed through New Chicago's streets. Again, the screech of hover cars and angry voices drew him to the window below. A crowd had gathered, their signs glowing in the twilight. Earth for humans, and stop the invasion. On the opposite side of the street, counter-protesters wore the teal armbands of the unifiers, chanting for peace and integration. His community buzzed. Mark, you seeing this? Tom Nelson's voice crackled through. Kind of hard to miss when it's right outside my window. You got your notice yet? Mark's jaw tightened. Just now, two of them. Apparently two. Tom whistled. Man, the authority must really trust your journalist credentials. Most of us only got one ex-journalist. Mark corrected, his voice sharp. He hadn't written a word since Mona's death 18 months ago, since Drake's betrayal. And I doubt my old press pass has anything to do with it. A crash from outside made him flinch. Someone had thrown a bottle at a unifier, and the crowd's roar grew louder. Listen, Tom, I should go. Me too. He trailed off, watching this riot. Police in their sleek black armor began to form lines. Yeah, clean up for your new roommates. Just be careful, okay? Some of these aliens, they're not what they seem. Mark ended the call, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window. Tired eyes, 3-day stubble, the kind of face that had seen too much and written about even more. He'd spent years exposing corruption and crime in the city's underbelly. Now he could barely leave his apartment without seeing ghosts of his past life. The cleaning drone word to life as he finally started preparing for his guests. His apartment was decent sized by post-integration standards: 2 bedrooms, a living area, and a kitchen that hadn't seen proper use in months. The drone zipped around, collecting empty coffee cups and organizing the chaos of his former life. His hand paused over a framed photo he'd kept face down on his desk. Mona smiled up at him, her dark curls catching sunlight from a day that felt like another lifetime. Behind her stood Drake, Sudie's, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at some forgotten joke. Mark slammed the frame back down. The protest outside swelled again. A new chant started. No alien overlords, no forced integration. Marcom unit lit up with another notification. Placement details: 2s and in females, arrival scheduled tomorrow. 900 hours center, he muttered, pulling up the species profile. His journalist instincts, dormant for so long, stirred despite himself. Purple-skinned humanoids, highly advanced civilization, recent political upheaval. The official files were sparse and ized, but he remembered whispers from his investigating days. Rumors of a society torn apart by class warfare and corruption. A message scrolled across his screen: failure to comply with placement will result in immediate sanctions. The room felt suddenly smaller. Tomorrow, his carefully constructed isolation would end. Tomorrow, he'd have to face people again, aliens no less, and all the complications that came with them. Outside, sirens wailed as the riots intensified. Mark closed his blinds, but he couldn't shut out the sound of his world changing yet again. Morning came too quickly. Mark had barely slept, spending hours researching Zenter and pacing his apartment. At precisely 09, his door chimed. 2 Alliance officers flanked a pair of figures in hooded gray cloaks. The taller officer, her nameplate reading Nelson, spoke first. Mr. Holloway, your assigned residence. The hoods came down, and Mark's carefully prepared greeting died in his throat. The Zenter were striking, both tall and graceful, their purple skin seeming to shimmer in his apartment's light. But where one's expression held careful neutrality, the other's blazed with barely contained defiance. I am Iret, said the calmer one, her voice musical despite its formality. Her eyes, a startling silver violet, met his briefly before dropping away. This is my sister, Lena. Charmed Lena drawled, her tone suggesting anything, but she was already scanning the apartment, her posture tense like a coiled spring. Officer Nelson cleared her throat. Standard integration period is 6 months minimum. All parties are required. Do we know the rules? Lena cut in. No need to repeat the propaganda. The officer's jaw tightened, but she merely nodded. Very well, Mr. Holloway, you have our contact information if there are any issues. After they left, silence fell. Mark found himself studying Era more closely. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal, but there was something in the way she held self, a guardedness that spoke of past wounds. The simple gray dress she wore couldn't hide her perfect figure, but it was her eyes that caught him, ancient and haunted despite her apparent youth. Lena broke the tension by dropping her bag on his couch. Nice place. Better than the last three. The last three? Mark asked before he could stop himself. Integration attempts, Lena said with a bitter smile. Turns out most humans don't appreciate our particular background. Lena Era warned softly. Mark's investigative instincts prickled. And what background? Is that the kind that makes people uncomfortable? Lena said, sprawling on his couch with deliberate casualness. But don't worry, we won't be here long enough for it to matter what my sister means. Era interjected, shooting Lena a look. Is that we understand if our presence is unwelcome. The Alliance's mandate is not always fair to hosts outside. A new protest chants started up. Mark moved to the window, noticing how both sisters tensed at the sound. I'm not going to throw you out, he said quietly. Whatever your background is, this is your home now for as long as you need it. Something flickered in Era's eyes, surprise, maybe even hope, before her walls came back up. You are kind, Mr. Holloway, but Mark, he corrected. Just Mark. Mark, she repeated. And something in the way she said his name made his pulse quicken. You don't know what you're offering? Then tell me. Lena laughed sharply. Oh, he's a curious one, isn't he? Careful, sister. Remember what happened last time someone got too interested in our story? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Era's hand went unconsciously to her neck, where Mark noticed a faint marking just visible above her collar. I used to be a journalist, he said, watching their reactions carefully. I know when there's more to a story. Used to be. Lena's eyes narrowed. What happened? Get too close to something dangerous? It was Mark's turn to tense. Images of Mona, of Drake's betrayal, flashed through his mind. Something like that. Then you understand, Era said softly, why some stories are better left untold. Their eyes met, and for a moment Mark saw a reflection of his own pain in her silver gaze. The connection was electric, unexpected, and clearly uncomfortable for her as she quickly looked away. Well, this is delightfully awkward, Lena announced, standing up. Where's my room? I need to wash off the stench of that processing center. Mark showed them to their rooms, trying not to notice how Ira's presence seemed to fill the space around her, or how Lena's eyes caught every detail of his apartment with almost professional assessment. As they settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to become very complicated. He just didn't know how right he was. Days blurred together in a strange new routine. Mark discovered that living with two Zenton sisters was like trying to tame lightning, beautiful, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. Lena claimed the couch as her domain, spreading data pads and mysterious devices across it. She spent hours monitoring something on them, though she always cleared the screens when Mark got too close. Era, meanwhile, moved through the apartment like a ghost, quiet and ethereal, though Mark often caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, a week after their arrival, Mark was preparing dinner when Era appeared in the kitchen doorway. You cook, she observed, her voice carrying that musical lilt that made his spine tingle. Someone has to be, gestured to the vegetables he was chopping. Want to help? She hesitated, then stepped forward. Her movements were graceful but uncertain as she took the knife he offered. On Zentra, food preparation was different. How so? Automated, efficient. A shadow crossed her face. Unless you were lower caste, then you prepared food by hand for others. Mark watched her hands, noting how they trembled slightly. And which were you? Neither. Her knife paused. I was property. The word hung heavy between them before Mark could respond. Lena's voice cut in from the doorway. Really, sister? Already sharing our tragic backstory? As walls slammed back up. I was merely explaining you were getting comfortable. Lena interrupted, her tone sharp. Remember what happens when we get comfortable. Hey, Mark set down his knife. This is your home now. You're allowed to be comfortable here. Lena's laugh was bitter. Home? This is a cage with nicer Bars were here because your alliance decided forcing aliens to live with humans would somehow fix centuries of prejudice. How's that working out? As if on cue, shouting erupted from the street below. The protest had become a nightly occurrence, growing more violent each time. They fear what they don't understand, Mark said. Quietly, no, Lena countered. They fear exactly what they understand, that the galaxy is bigger and more terrible than they ever imagined. Era's knife clattered to the counter. A thin line of darker purple welled up on her finger where she'd cut herself. Mark reached for her hand instinctively, but she jerked away. I'm fine, she said, but her voice shook. Let me see. He kept his tone gentle, professional. After a moment's hesitation, she extended her hand. The cut was shallow, but as he cleaned it, he noticed other marks on her wrist, old scars, too regular to be accidents. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing, simply bandaging the cut with careful movements. You have a gentle touch, she murmured. For someone who uncovers ugly truths, used to uncover, he corrected, but his old investigative instincts were screaming. These women weren't simply refugees, they were running from something. Lena watched their interaction with narrowed eyes. Careful, Mr. X journalist, curiosity killed more than cats. Where we come from, good thing. We're not where you come from. Then he finished with A's hand, but didn't immediately let go. Her skin was warm under his fingers, sending little sparks up his arm. She pulled away first, retreating to the far side of the kitchen. Thank you. The rest of dinner prep passed in tense silence. They ate together as they had every night since the sisters arrived, but tonight the quiet felt heavier. Later, as Mark was cleaning up his comm unit, Buzz Tom's face appeared, looking worried. Mark, you need to see this. A video feed appeared, showing riots in the city center. They're saying some aliens are actually spies, gathering intel on Earth's defenses. The traditionalists are demanding house searches. Not happening. Mark cut him off, glancing toward the sisters' rooms. They're not going anywhere. Just be careful, okay? Something bigger is going on. My sources say. The feed suddenly cut out. Mark looked up to find Lena in the doorway, holding some kind of device. Signal jammer, she explained casually. Can't be too careful these days. You're blocking my calls, now protecting us all. She stepped closer, her voice dropping. Listen carefully, Mark Holloway. You seem decent, which is rare enough, but people who get close to us tend to disappear, or worse. Is that a threat, a warning? She pocketed the jammer. My sister is starting to trust you. That makes you dangerous to us and to yourself. I can handle dangerous like you handled whatever made you quit journalism. Her words hit like a physical blow. We all have ghosts, Mark. Don't let yours get tangled up with ours. She turned to go, then paused. Oh, and if you're wondering why we were really assigned to you specifically, ask yourself who might want to keep a close eye on a journalist who got too close to something he shouldn't have. Mark stood alone in his kitchen, mind racing. The protests outside grew louder, but he barely heard them. Instead, he remembered Mona's last words to him. Some stories are bigger than we think. Mark, be careful who you trust. In her room, Era stood at the window, one hand absently tracing the mark on her neck, a mark that, unknown to Mark, was more than just a slave brand. It was a key, and somewhere in the city someone was very interested in finding it. And in the living room, Lena sent an encrypted message. He's asking questions. What are your orders? The response came instantly. Keep him close. We need him. She deleted both messages, then settled back on the couch, her face troubled. For the first time since their assignment, she wondered if she was protecting her sister or leading her into greater danger. Later that night, Mark couldn't sleep. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city and the soft hum of the environmental controls. He found himself in his office, pulling up old case files he hadn't looked at in months. A soft sound made him turn. Era stood in the doorway, wearing a simple sleep garment that made her purple skin seem to glow in the dim light. You should be sleeping, she said. So should you. She moved into the room like flowing water, glancing at his screens. You're investigating us. Force of habit. He didn't bother denying it. There's something bigger going on here, isn't there? The placement wasn't random. No, she admitted softly. It wasn't. Why me? She was close enough now that he could see the faint patterns in her skin like scattered starlight. Because you stopped asking questions when someone wanted you to. They thought you'd do the same with us, and will. Either eyes met in the darkness. Something electric passed between them. dangerous and thrilling that depends, she whispered, on whether you've learned from your past mistakes or you're doomed to repeat them. Before he could respond, she was gone, leaving only the ghost of her presence and the weight of unspoken warnings. Mark turned back to his screens. But his mind was elsewhere. He'd sworn off investigating after Mona's death. But now the story was living in his home, wearing his sister's clothes and carrying secrets that could probably get them all killed outside the cities. Protest finally quieted, but a different kind of tension filled the apartment, the kind that came with unspoken truths, hidden agendas, and the dangerous territory between duty and desire. The first act was ending. The pieces were in place, and somewhere in the city Drake Seuss received a message about his old friend's new house guests and smiled. The game was just beginning. 2 weeks after the sisters' arrival, Mark woke to the sound of breaking glass. He found AA in the kitchen, surrounded by shattered ceramic, her purple skin almost white with shock. A brick lay among the fragments, wrapped in paper with alien scum spray painted across it. "I'm sorry," she whispered, starting to clean up. "I was just making tea." "Don't." Mark caught her wrist, feeling her pulse race beneath his fingers. "You'll cut yourself." Their eyes met, and for a moment neither moved. Then Lena's voice cut through the tension. "Well, isn't this cozy?" She leaned against the doorframe, but her casual pose couldn't hide her tension. "Our 4th brick this week. They're getting better at aim." Mark released Era's wrist. "Know how?" She immediately stepped back. "I'll talk to building security again. Don't bother." Lena moved to examine the brick. "They're probably the ones telling the traditionalists where we are not. Everyone is against us," Era said softly. "No." Lena's laugh was sharp. "Tell that to the last 3 families who hosted us. Or should I say turned us in." Mark's community buzzed a message from Tom. "Check the news." Now the hollow screen flickered to life, showing footage of Drake Seuss addressing reporters outside Seuss Industries' gleaming headquarters. Mark's hands clenched as his old friend's familiar face filled the screen. "Breakthrough in human-alien relations," Drake was saying, his charisma practically radiating through the screen. "Our new integration technology will ensure peaceful coexistence by allowing better understanding between species." "Turn it off," Mark growled, but the Ira had gone, still staring at the screen. "That device behind him, it's Zenon. Ancient tech." "How did he?" "Ancient tech that shouldn't exist anymore," Lena cut in, her voice hard. "Tech that was destroyed for a reason." Mark looked between them. "What kind of tech?" "The kind that doesn't promote understanding," Lena spat. "Promotes control." The screen showed Drake demonstrating something, a small device that pulsed with familiar purple light. Era's hand went to her neck. "To that, Mark." Mark had noticed before. "You know something about this," he said. "It wasn't a question." Mark Era started, but Lena cut her off. "Don't. He's a journalist. Everything we say becomes a story." "Ex-journalist," Mark correct automatically, but his mind was racing. The tech, the sisters' mysterious placement with him, specifically Drake's sudden public appearance. "This isn't coincidence, is it?" He turned to Era. "You being placed here with me." Before she could answer, another brick crashed through the window. This time the note attached read, "Drake Seuss knows the truth." Lena cursed in what sounded like Zenon. "We need to move." "No." Mark's voice was firm. "Running is exactly what they want. Besides, you can't leave Alliance law." "Alliance law won't matter if we're dead," Lena snapped. "Or worse, if Drake gets what he wants." "And what does he want?" The sisters exchanged looks. Finally Era spoke. "Me, or rather what I carry." She touched her neck again, and this time Mark saw the mark begin to glow faintly purple, matching the light from Drake's device on the screen. "It's not just a slave brand, is it?" "No." Era's voice was barely a whisper. "It's a key to technology that should have stayed buried in Zent's ruins. The same technology Drake's now showing off to the world," Lena added grimly. Mark's investigative instincts were screaming now, but they were drowned out by something else, a fierce protectiveness he hadn't felt since Mona. "Tell me everything," he said. Lena opened her mouth to object, but AA raised a hand. "He deserves to know, especially since." She hesitated. "Since Drake was the one who arranged our placement here." Mark felt the blood drain from his face. "What? Think about it," Lena said, suddenly looking tired. "Who better to watch the ex-journalist who got too close to the truth than the very people he's investigating?" "But that means," Mark's mind raced, "you're working for Drake were Era corrected quickly until we saw what he really planned to do with the tech. The room fell silent except for the newsfeed, where Drake continued his speech about unity and progress. Mark stared at his old friend's face. Remembering another time, another betrayal Mona knew, didn't she? He asked. Quietly about Drake's real plans. Era moved closer, her presence somehow both comforting and dangerous. Yes, and now you know why she had to die. Mark slumped onto his couch, memories flooding back. Mona's last investigation, her frantic calls about something big. She discovered Drake's concerned warnings about her mental state. And then the accident that killed her. Drake wasn't just my friend, he said finally. He was my partner in investigative journalism. We exposed corruption together, fought for truth. When Mona and I started dating, he was genuinely happy for us, or so I thought. People change, Lena said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. Especially when power is involved. AA sat beside Mark close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her purple skin. Tell us what happened. Mona was investigating disappearances, humans and aliens who'd vanished without trace. She tracked them to a research facility outside the city. Drake told me she was becoming paranoid, seeing conspiracies everywhere. He swallowed hard. I believed him. And then she died. Era finished softly. Car accident, very clean, very neat, except he looked up at the sisters. The body was never found. Lena cursed again, because there probably wasn't one. Drake's facility, it's still operating, isn't it? Before Mark could answer, a knock at the door made them all freeze. Through the security feed they saw an elderly couple. The Petersons from next door, your neighbors, Lena said suspiciously. They're safe, Mark assured her, moving to the door. They're hosting the Zenton scientist themselves. Mrs. Peterson burst in as soon as he opened the door. Mark, dear, you need to see this. Cass found something behind her. Mr. Peterson ushered in a young Zenton male whose purple skin was several shades darker than the sisters. His eyes widened when he saw Era and Lena. By the ancestors, he breathed, you're really here? The rumors were true. Cass, Mrs. Peterson scolded gently. You promised to explain first. The young scientist pulled out a data crystal. I've been analyzing the tech Salty's Industries displayed today. It's based on forbidden Zenon designs. Mind control devices from our third dynasty, but they're incomplete. They need. He looked at Era. They need a living key. Era's hand went to her neck. The mark, not just the mark, Cass said. Your genetic code. You're a keeper. Aren't you one of the royal line? Mark turned to Era in surprise. She wouldn't meet his eyes. That's why you were enslaved. He realized, not just his punishment. To hide who you really were. My sister, Lena said fiercely, is more than just her bloodline. But that's why Drake wants her. Cass pressed. Without a keeper's genetic key, the control technology is unstable. It could drive its victims mad instead of controlling them. Mrs. Peterson touched Mark's arm. Dear, is this connected to what happened to Mona? The room went quiet. Mark stared at the elderly woman. What do you know about Mona? Only what we've observed. The facility where she disappeared. We can see it from our apartment. Strange lights at night, unmarked vehicles, and completely sounds. She shuddered, screaming. Mr. Peterson put an arm around his wife. We tried reporting it, but the authorities aren't interested, especially not when it comes to alien matters. Show me. Mark demanded. They moved to the Petersons' apartment. Their corner unit had a clear view of the city's industrial district and the supposedly abandoned research facility on its outskirts. Their Cass pointed to a building that seemed to shimmer slightly, cloaking technologies and in design again, but looked through his enhanced viewer. Mark could see figures moving on the roof. One of them was unmistakably Drake. He's there now, Mark growled, planning his next move, testing his tech more likely. Lena said grimly, on whoever's unlucky enough to be inside. Era pressed against the window. Her face troubled. Those signals, they're like the ones from the breeding farms on Zentra, where they broke slaves' minds to make them compliant. Mark saw her shoulders shake and acted on instinct, pulling her into his arms. She stiffened for a moment, then melted against him. Her skin was silk smooth against his, her scent like exotic flowers. We have to stop him, she whispered against his chest. We will. He looked at the others. But we need proof, evidence that will stand up to alliance scrutiny. I can help with that. Cass offered. The tech leaves distinct energy Signatures, if we can get close enough. No, Lena stepped between them. We're not risking anyone else. This is our fight. Mrs. Peterson made a disapproving noise. Nonsense, dear. We're all in this together. Now the Alliance wanted integration. Well, they've got it. We protect our own. Mr. Peterson nodded firmly. Our apartment can be your base of operations. The surveillance from here is perfect, and no one suspects a nice old couple of anything. Mark felt Era laugh softly against him. They're right. We need allies, and you've got them, Cass added. There's a whole network of us humans and aliens working together, sharing information. The real integration, not Drake's forced control. Mark looked down at Era, still in his arms. Her silver-violet eyes met his, filled with trust. He wasn't sure he deserved. We'll need a plan, he said. Drake's too smart for a frontal assault. Good thing you've got a master strategist. Lena smirked. Or did you think I was just the pretty sister? First, Cass interrupted. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Ira, may I scan your Mark? The data could be crucial. Ira hesitated, then nodded. She stepped away from Mark, and he immediately missed her warmth. The Mark glowed under Cass's scanner, revealing intricate patterns beneath the surface. Incredible, the young scientist breathed. It's not just a key. It's a complete database of Zenton biotechnology. No wonder Drake wants it. With this, he could control not just minds but entire body biological systems, making humans the dominant species. Mark finished by enslaving everyone else. Not everyone, Lena corrected, just those he deems inferior. Sound familiar? History repeating itself, Era said softly. Like Centrafall. A notification pinged on Mark's community, a message from Drake. Miss me, old friend, we should talk for old time's sake. Below it was an address, the research facility. He knows we're on to him. Mark said it's a trap, Lena stated flatly. Obviously. Mark looked at the facility through the window. But it might be our only chance to find out what happened to Mona, if she's still alive. Era left the sentence hanging. She is. Mark wasn't sure how he knew, but he did. Drake wouldn't waste a valuable test subject. The thought made him sick, but it strengthened his resolve. So Mrs. Peterson said brightly, shall I put on some tea while you all plan how to take down an evil corporation? Her casual tone broke the tension. Even Lena cracked a smile. Tea would be perfect, Era said. We have a long night ahead. As the others gathered around the Petersons' kitchen table, Mark stayed by the window watching Drake's facility. Somewhere in there were answers about Mona, about Drake's fall from grace, about the technology that could enslave worlds. And beside him, her presence, both comfort and challenge, stood Era, not just a refugee or a slave or even a royal key, but someone who stirred feelings in him. He thought long dead. The game had changed now. They just had to survive it. The Galactic Alliance summit loomed over New Chicago like a shimmering beacon, or a target depending on who you asked. From the Petersons' apartment, Mark watched dignitaries from a dozen worlds arrive in their gleaming ships. Quite the show. Lena muttered, her fingers dancing over a data pad. She hadn't slept in days, constantly monitoring Drake's communications. All those important people in one place. Perfect timing. Mark caught the edge in her voice. She'd been different since they discovered Drake's plan, more withdrawn, almost guilty now. She wouldn't meet his eyes. Something you want to tell me? He asked quietly before she could answer. Era emerged from the bedroom wearing a formal Alliance uniform that made her purple skin glow. The sight of her knocked the breath from Mark's lungs. The credentials Cass provided should get us inside, she said, adjusting the high collar that hid her. Mark, but Drake will be watching. Let him watch. Mark moved closer, drawn to her like gravity. That's the point. Their eyes met, and the air crackled between them. They'd grown closer over the past weeks, planning, preparing, touching, but never quite crossing that final line. Now, with everything about to explode, the tension was almost unbearable. You should tell him, Ela said suddenly. They both turned. She stood by the window, looking more vulnerable than Mark had ever seen her. Tell me, what about the reports? Lena's voice cracked. The ones I've been sending Drake about you, about everything. The room went silent. Mark felt Era stiffen beside him. How long? He asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Since the beginning, he promised. Lena swallowed hard. He promised to free Era, remove the Mark. I thought I was protecting her by betraying us. Mark. Era touched his arm. She's my sister, and now she's compromised everything we've planned. No. Lena straightened now. I'm going to fix it. The reports, they weren't all accurate. I've been feeding him what he expects to hear. But she pulled up a holographic display. I've also been mapping his facility, every entrance, every security pattern. And I know where he's keeping Mona. Mark's heart stopped. She's alive after a fashion. Lena's expression was grim. Drake, he loved her in his twisted way. When she discovered what he was planning, he couldn't bring himself to kill her. Instead, he used her as his first test subject for the mind control tech. But it wasn't ready. Era whispered. Without a proper genetic key, it burned out her mind, left her body intact but empty. Drake keeps her there, still trying to save her. Lena's laugh was bitter. He thinks once he perfects the technology, he can restore her, make her love him again. Mark felt sick. All this time, Mona had been there, trapped in her own body. While Drake, the summit begins in 3 hours, Lena continued. Drake plans to use the gathered delegates as his first mass test. With Oz genetic key, he thinks the tech will finally work properly. And you're telling us this now? Mark demanded. Because now I know what side I'm really on. She met his eyes steadily. I'll get you into the facility, help you stop him, whatever it takes, even if it means sacrificing yourself. Era asked softly. Lena smiled, a real smile for once. Wouldn't be much of a redemption otherwise, would it? Before anyone could respond, Cass burst in. They're moving. Drake's people, they're activating something in the facility. Energy readings are off the charts. Through the window, they could see a purple glow beginning to pulse from the research facility hidden depths. He's starting early. Lena cursed. We need to move now. Mark looked at AA, saw his own determination reflected in her silver-violet eyes. Then he turned to Lena. If you betray us again, I won't. She held out her hand. I swear by the ancestors, by everything I am, let me make this right. He took her hand. Then let's end this. Drake's facility loomed before them, its cloaking field shimmering like heat waves. Using Lena's codes, they bypassed the outer security with ease. Too much ease. Mark thought. He's expecting us. Era whispered her shoulder, brushing his as they moved through darkened corridors. Good. Mark checked his weapon, a neural disruptor designed to counter mind control effects. Let him expect. Lena led them deeper past laboratories filled with strange equipment. Through observation windows, they saw test subjects, both human and alien, connected to machines that pulsed with that sickly purple glow. The lower levels, Lena indicated, that's where he keeps the primary control hub, and she hesitated. Mona, the elevator descended silently. Mark felt Ao's hand slip into his, a gesture of comfort. He hadn't realized he needed. Whatever we find, she said softly. You're not alone anymore. The doors opened to chaos. Drake stood in a vast, circular chamber surrounded by holographic displays and thrumming equipment. The purple light was blinding here, emanating from a central pillar that reached to the ceiling and connected to that pillar. Mona. Mark breathed. She hung suspended in a field of energy, her body pristine, but her eyes were empty, vacant, dead, while still breathing. Welcome home, old friend. Drake's voice was exactly as Mark remembered, warm, reasonable, completely mad. I was hoping you'd bring our special guest. Guards materialized from hidden alcoves surrounding them. Lena raised her hand slowly. I brought them, just like you asked, she said. Now keep your promise. Mark's blood ran cold beside him. Era went rigid. Did Drake laughed. Oh, Lena, did you really think you were playing me, that I didn't know about your little double agent routine? He gestured, and the guards grabbed her. Still, you served your purpose, and now, his eyes fixed on Aaron. Now I have everything I need. The summit. Mark realized this was never about testing it there. You needed us to bring Era here. The summit is still part of the plan. Drake moved closer, his eyes fever bright. But first I need to perfect the process, and for that he reached for Era's neck, where her mark was beginning to glow in response to the chamber's energy. I need the last piece of the puzzle. Don't touch her. Mark snarled, raising his disruptor. Or what, you'll shoot me? Drake's smile was sad, like you should have done when Mona discovered the truth. When she begged you to believe her, you killed her. I tried to save her. Drake's composure cracked. She understood at the end. Humanity needs protection, control. The aliens may have technology, may have numbers, but we have something they don't, the will to do what's necessary. He pressed a control, and Mona's body twitched, her empty eyes opening. Look at her. Mark, really? Look, I can bring her back once the process is perfected. Once I have the key. He reached for Era again. Multiple things happened at once. Lena drove an elbow into her guard's throat, breaking free. Now cast the chambers. Lights flickered as something disrupted the power. Mark blazed like a star. And she screamed a sound of pain and defiance, and Mona's body convulsed. The energy field around her destabilizing. No, Drake lunged for his controls. The connection, you're disrupting the stasis field. Good. Lena spat, fighting her way toward the central pillar. It's time to let her rest. Mark found himself moving without conscious thought, fighting through guards to reach Mona. Her body was beginning to fade, the years of artificial preservation finally failing Mark. Her voice was a whisper, a last echo of consciousness. "Let me go, I'm sorry," he choked. "I'm so sorry." I didn't believe her empty eyes fixed on his face one last time. Then the field collapsed, and she crumpled, finally truly gone. No, Drake's scream was inhuman. He slammed his hand down on a control panel. "If I can't save her, I'll save everyone else, whether they want it or not." The chambers' energy surged across the city. They could hear screams as the power reached for minds, trying to bind them. But AA stood straight, her Mark blazing. "You don't understand the technology you're using," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "It was never meant to control. It was meant to connect." She pressed her hand to the central pillar, and the purple light changed, becoming something softer, more natural. "Lena," she called the resonance key. Her sister was already moving, pulling something from her boot, a small crystal that pulsed in harmony with Mark. "I knew you'd try to betray us," she told Drake, who stared in horror, "so I made sure we had a backup plan." She slammed the crystal into a port on the pillar. Energy exploded outward, and Lena screamed as it coursed through her. No, Era reached for her sister, but Mark held her back. "It has to be done," Lena gasped. "My redemption." Remember, the crystal pulsed one final time, and Lena collapsed as the chamber's equipment began to overload. "We need to go." Mark grabbed Era, who was trying to reach her sister. "The whole place is going to blow." Not without her. Together they managed to get Lena's unconscious form away from the pillar. Drake stood frozen, staring at Mona's body as his life's work crumbled around him. "Drake," Mark called, "come on." But his old friend just smiled, that same warm smile from their reporting days. "Take care of them, Mark." "Better than I took care of her." The ceiling began to collapse as they ran, carrying Lena between them. Behind them, Drake's laughter echoed, then was silenced by an explosion that shook the entire facility. 3 days later, Mark stood by Elena's hospital bed, watching her sister hold her hand. The doctor said she would recover, though the energy surge had left its mark. Streaks of silver now ran through her purple skin like lightning bolts. "The summit is reconvening," he told them. "The Alliance is calling for major reforms after what happened. Real integration, not forced coexistence." And the technology Era asked, not taking her eyes off her sister. "Destroyed, though Cass says some of it might be salvageable. The parts about connection, not control. He thinks it could actually help with integration if used properly." Lena stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Did we win?" "Yes," Era smiled, squeezing her hand. "We won." "Good." Lena tried to sit up, winced. "Because if I sacrificed my stunning good looks for nothing, I'm going to be very annoyed." Mark laughed, a real laugh, for the first time in what felt like years. "The silver suits you. Very dramatic." "Everything about me is dramatic." But her smile faded. "Mark, about Mona, she's at peace now." He was surprised to find he meant it. "That's what matters." Through the hospital window they could see the city changing. Humans and aliens walked together openly now, the protest replaced by a cautious optimism. The Petersons had even started a cultural exchange program from their apartment with Cass as their first success story. "So what now?" Lena asked, looking between Mark and her sister with a knowing smile. Era finally turned from the bed, meeting Mark's eyes. The connection between them, growing for so long, sparked like electricity. "Now," she said softly, moving toward him. "We stopped waiting." Mark pulled her close, one hand cupping her face. Her skin was warm under his fingers, her silver violet eyes full of promise. "About time," Lena muttered, but they barely heard her. When their lips met, it felt like coming home, like endings and beginnings of all at once. Her mouth was soft against his, her body fitting perfectly in his arms as years of pain and loneliness melted away. They broke apart to the sound of Lena's dramatic, retching noises. "If you're going to get all romantic, at least wait until I'm not trapped in bed, unable to escape." AA laughed against Mark's chest. "We should probably let you rest anyway." Don't you dare leave me alone in this primitive medical facility." Primitive Mark raised an eyebrow. "I thought you liked humans, now I tolerate some of them." Lena's eyes softened. The ones who proved themselves worthy of trust outside the sun was setting over New Chicago, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Mark held Era close, feeling her. Mark pulls softly against his hand, no longer a tool for control, but a symbol of connection, of bridging differences, of love. "Stay with me," he whispered in her ear. She turned in his arms, her smile radiant. "Always, oh, for ancestors' sake," Lena groaned. "Just kiss again and get it over with." They did. And in a city learning to embrace difference, in a galaxy finding its way toward true understanding, their love became a symbol of what was possible when barriers fell and hearts opened. It wasn't perfect. There would always be those who feared change, who sought control over connection. But as Mark held Era, as Lena complained about their mushiness, while secretly beaming as the Peterson and Cass worked to build bridges between worlds, one thing became clear: the future belonged to those brave enough to reach across the divide, to trust, to love. And that was a story worth telling. Epilogue. 1 year later, the rooftop garden of Mark's apartment building bloomed with both earth and xenon flowers, their mingled scents filling the evening air. Below, New Chicago pulsed with life, its streets now filled with a vibrant mix of species living and working together. Mark adjusted his formal jacket, watching as guests filtered in for what the Petersons had insisted on calling the Unity C celebration, though really it was a much more personal occasion. Lena strutted through the crowd, the silver streaks in her purple skin catching the light. She turned her scars into a fashion statement, and now ran a successful security consulting firm, specializing in cross-species protection. "Stop fidgeting," she told Mark, straightening his collar. "You look fine, though not nearly good enough for my sister." "No one is," he agreed with a smile. Cass and his research team had set up a small display showing their progress on adapting the salvage connection technology for peaceful purposes. The young scientist had become the face of humans, and in cooperation with the Peterson, proudly acting as his surrogate grandparents. "The latest trials are showing amazing results," he was explaining to a group of fascinated observers. "Voluntary mental linking is allowing unprecedented cultural exchange and understanding." Tom Nelson stood by the bar chatting with some of Mark's old journalism contacts. The story of Drake's facility and the fight to stop him had reignited Mark's writing career, though now he focused on promoting understanding between species rather than exposing corruption. A small memorial stone sat in a quiet corner of the garden, engraved with Mona's name, not a reminder of pain anymore, but of the importance of truth and the price of ignoring it. The crowd suddenly hushed. Mark turned to see Era emerge from the doorway, and his heart stopped. She wore a traditional Xenon ceremonial dress, the flowing purple fabric making her seem to float. Her Mark, now a symbol of connection rather than control, glowed softly at her throat, but it was her smile, radiant, full of love, that took his breath away. As she reached him, Lena stepped forward to begin the ceremony, a blend of earth and Xenon traditions they created together 1 year ago. She announced, "These two helped change our worlds. They showed us that true unity comes not from control or force, but from opening our hearts to difference, from choosing love over fear." She took their hands, placing them together. The silver streaks in her skin flickered in response to Era's mark, a permanent connection between the sisters forged in that final battle, and they've inspired others. She continued, "The Galactic Alliance has adopted new integration policies based on voluntary connection. The Petersons' cultural exchange program has spread to cities across Earth. Even the remnants of Drake's technology have been transformed into tools for understanding, standing rather than control." Mark squeezed Era's hand, seeing their shared future in her silver-violet eyes. "But most importantly," Lena finished with a smirk, "they finally stopped dancing around each other and admitted what everyone else could see from day one." The crowd laughed. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes while her husband beamed proudly. Cass raised a glass in salute. The words of the ceremony blended earth and Xenon vows, promises of unity, of respect for difference, of love that bridged worlds. When they kissed, AAS Mark pulsed with joy, sending waves of soft Purple light across the garden. Even Lena didn't make gagging noises this time, though she did wipe away a suspicious bit of moisture from her eyes later as they danced under the stars. Mark held his new wife close. Happy, he murmured in her ear. Complete, she corrected, resting her head on his shoulder. Across the garden, Lena was teaching the Petersons a traditional Zenton dance, while Cass explained the cultural significance to fascinated onlookers. Humans and aliens mingled freely, their laughter and conversation rising into the night air. This was the future they'd fought for, not perfect, not without challenges, but full of hope and possibility. I love you, Era whispered, the words still new and wonderful on her tongue. Mark kissed her, feeling her mark warm against his skin, a reminder that the greatest connections come not from control, but from trust, from love, from choosing to be better together than apart. And as the celebration continued around them as their family of different species and worlds celebrated unity and love, they knew that some stories don't just end, they transform, they inspire. They continue in the lives they touch and the changes they spark. And this story, their story, was just beginning as the purple sunset fades over New Chicago and this story draws to a close. I can't help but think about the walls we build and the courage it takes to tear them down. Mark, Era and Lena's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest adventures